What has happened, though, which surprised me, and I'm curious if it surprised you, is that there has been zero defection from Republican voters. I really did think the party would be much more divided during his presidency. He has a higher approval rating among Republicans now than George W. Bush had at this point in his presidency. So is this now, this is what the Republican Party has become, the Trump Party, or were they always this way looking for somebody like Trump?
You have literally the best journalists. You have a wonderful pollster up on this stage. I am not someone who is as plugged in, nearly as plugged in as they are into the kind of day-to-day news cycle. Yeah. What I will say, however, is that in 2008, I co-authored a book with a friend of mine, Ross Douthat, called Grand New Party. And the argument we made in that book is that the Republican Party, the elite of the Republican Party, was very much out of touch with the base of the Republican Party as the base of the Republican Party was changing. We argued that a Republican Party that would be durably successful, that would durably win elections, would be a party that was more economically populist and, as a cultural message, would offer a unifying nationalism, that would take concerns about immigration seriously, and that would also really talk about integration, amalgamation. How do we incorporate folks who are now part of the marginal working class, people who are really marginalized in our society? How do you bring them in to a broad, pan-ethnic, working class, middle class? And this argument was not taken terribly seriously at the time. But our argument was, look, there are all kinds of incentives at the elite level to not do this. Politicians are very, very risk averse. They are not going to pursue a course unless there is a precedent for that course, right? So, we were out there saying this, hey, people said we were really clever, we were patted on the head, all of this stuff. But of course, no one had any reason to actually do this. Why? Because when you actually saw Republican presidential campaigns, when you actually saw people try to offer some kind of populist challenge, some kind of new ideological synthesis, they always lost. Now, what would happen is that you would have someone like a Mike Huckabee trying to kind of say, okay, I'm going to be a different kind of candidate. I'm going to be a bit more populist. But he wound up appearing to be a sectarian, Southern, evangelical candidate who never really broke out of that lane. If you look at Rick Santorum, this is not the most charismatic guy in the world, but he was trying to offer a kind of Rust Belt friendly, kind of industrial policy friendly, working family friendly message. And he actually did remarkably well for someone who had no money on his side, right? So then Donald Trump comes along, and Donald Trump does not need money. He has free media. He has the equivalent of billions of dollars of free media. And by the way, most of that coverage is in fact pretty hostile. Not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it. But regardless, he was able to get around the gatekeepers within the Republican Party. And what he did is he set a precedent. So then look at Indiana. You have a candidate like Mike Brown. Maybe he's going to lose. But he is a very interesting Senate candidate in Indiana because he was a Democrat. He's a guy who talks about industrial policy, talks about trade. He's pro-life. He's a social conservative. But those aren't really the core components of his message. So it's really interesting to see this kind of Rust Belt populist component of the party, this swing state republicanism that wasn't there before. But this is a panel about Democrats. And one thing I want to really drive home about Democrats is that this shift in the Republican Party would not have happened without a shift in the Democratic Party. That's something that people tend to neglect. Both parties, as their coalitions change, as they grow, as they shrink, they necessarily affect the rival party's coalition. So in 2008, Hillary Clinton's near victory, her near majority coalition among Democrats was very heavily composed of working class, lower middle class white voters. Those voters by 2016, those were not the core of Hillary Clinton's constituency. Over that intervening period of time, those voters came unmoored, they came loose. Now, some of them were people who had voted Republican in other elections before, et cetera, but the last vestiges of their Democratic identity were unloosed. Now, here's another thing. Think about Europe's center-left social democratic parties. All of these parties are moving to the right on immigration. That is not happening in the United States. Why is that? One explanation is that in Europe, you've got to have those working class white votes. In the United States, there is a belief, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, that you've transcended that, you moved into a different world, and that it's not strictly necessary, that there is a new rainbow working class that you can rely on to be the basis of your majority. So you see this big cleavage, and it's not inevitable for a center-left party to do that. But this Democratic Party, you know, $80 million is going to be spent by Michael Bloomberg in swing districts around the country. Silicon Valley is a big part of the donor base of this party with its distinctive sensibilities. So I think that that's a really big part of the Democratic story going forward.